Hi y'all! Today I wanted to share with you 6 books that all writers should read that aren't about writing. So most writers I talk to, and myself included, are always interested in finding new information and new books to read that will help us as writers become better writers. It's not difficult to go on Amazon and search for books on writing or books on storytelling, books on grammar, books on story structure, books on anything marketed toward writers. But what I wanted to talk about today is books that aren't aimed toward writers or aren't aimed toward storytellers, but still can help a writer significantly when viewed through a writerly lens.
Bazinga!
So I've got 6 books I want to share with you today. I've read all of these books and do recommend them. I read most of them within the last year. And I've tried to identify what genres or what situations I think these particular books would be most helpful in. I'm also going to try to be brief. I could go on about some of these books for hours. I really could, because a lot of material is covered in some of them. And a lot of them are very applicable in certain writing situations. But I'm going to try to keep this video brief. I'm going to try really, really, really hard.
But if you only knew how many things I want to say and don't, give me some credit.
So the first book I want to talk to you about is The Mask of Masculinity by Lewis Howes. This was published in 2007 and is a USA Today bestseller. The author is the host of a very successful podcast called The School of Greatness, where he interviews highly successful people from all fields and all sorts of backgrounds. This is marketed as a self-help book for men and for the women who love them. However, I think it can be a fantastic writing tool for really anyone who wants to write male characters in a predominantly Western environment, or any sort of world where you have similar masculine expectations to our current Western environment. To sum up very briefly, this book analyzes the extremely murky definitions that our Western society has about masculinity, and it analyzes the different effects that the stringent enforcement that our culture has on these ill-defined definitions of masculinity can have on an individual and on a population at large.
I'm gonna take that man card, hand it over. Boys, we got us a real funny joker. The Lord gave you balls, didn't he, son? Now swap that card and get you a gun. She got you roped, saddled, and gilded too. You don't wanna hear it, but man, it's the truth. That 30-30 ain't gonna do no harm. If you don't buy the gun right now, I'm gonna take that man card.
He talks about 9 different common masks that men wear, some of the reasoning behind some of these masks, including the Joker mask for the guy who always hides behind humor, the know-it-all mask for the guy who always thinks he's right, the material mask for the man who's always working and striving for that next goal and never seems to know when to stop. He goes through all of these masks and he talks about the underlying psychology and the underlying feelings and emotions that push men into the stereotypical roles that they feel society demands of them. For any writer or storyteller who wants to write more nuanced male characters, who wants to add more depth to their male characters, this is highly recommended. Book number 2 is going to be for anyone who really wants to up their game in world building. So anyone who wants to write fantasy, science fiction, alternative histories, anything of this nature where you need a large history of world building, you want more than just a one-on-one correlation. So often in fantasy, science fiction, alternative histories, I see one-to-one correlations in world buildings. One event happened, one bad guy did this one thing, and it caused a massive change, and that's where we are today in the story. This is lazy, and it's just not how things work. Every decision you make in world building is going to have unintended consequences. You as an author can't foresee all of those unintended consequences because the organics of a society evolving is dependent upon millions, thousands, hundreds of individuals all making choices on their own. You can't keep track of all that. But you can have a better idea of how it works in a real-world organic environment by reading some history. One of the best examples I could suggest to read to get this idea of how to world build organically using these unintended consequences and using something that just feels natural and just feels like it evolved in a very natural way is War Against the Weak by Edmund Black. This was published in 2003. Edmund Black is an investigative author who specializes in human rights, in government corruption, and in genocide. Three things which pop up a lot in epic fantasies, in sci-fi operas, in things where you're going to blow up a lot of planets. Even the briefest of summary would take up a solid 15 minutes on this book. Now, I will say it's a thick book. It's not as bad as it looks.
I like big books and I cannot lie.
It's 444 pages of actual text. The rest, that much, is notes and bibliographies, references, stuff you don't have to read. So it's still thick, but it's not as bad. Another thing I will say about this book, it's not difficult to follow. It's not difficult to read. I was able to follow it just fine, and my background is in science, not in history. Edmund Black is, in addition to being an investigative author, he is also a novelist. And that shows up in the writing. This is not hard to follow. Of course, it's history, it's not a story, so there are a lot of names that pop in, for one event, and then you never see them again. But each chapter and each section has its own internal logic. He organized this exceptionally well. If you're interested in reading the book, don't be intimidated by its size and topic. I got through it just fine. So this talks about America's flirtation with eugenics in the 20th century. For the non-history buffs out there, Hitler actually got his idea for eugenics in the gas chambers from California. From us. We started that shit. There was a German monk named Gregory Mendel who wanted to study inheritance. He planted a garden, he studied peas, and he learned that when he crossbred different varieties, he could get predictable patterns of inheritance. Up until this time, it was believed that children had what they called blended inheritance. So they took the average of the two parents' traits and they got the kid. So you would have a tall parent, you would have a short parent, you would end up with a kid of medium height. Now we know this isn't the case anymore, but this basic idea made it into the common consciousness during a time of significant social change and disruption. The early 20th century was a time of the Industrial Revolution, was a time of widening economic gaps. If you really think about it, within 2 generations, having a lot of children went from being an economic asset because children could work a farm and produce more food to being an economic disaster because now you had to support children and you didn't work on a farm. There was massive social change, there was sweeping poverty, and people looked around and saw that this couldn't be sustainable, but they didn't know how to fix it. And they latched on to this idea of inheritance and tried to associate it with things not just like eye color and adult height, but things like poverty, social class, criminal behavior. These were things they associated with genetics. And from this idea, eugenics was born. This was an American idea. And it led to some really bad things, including the Holocaust and to the very near genocide of the Native American population in the 1970s. So basically, this is a 100-year snapshot of how one small scientific discovery snowballed in a culture and a society that was ripe for it into massive social change, massive legal change, and to some severely dire consequences. And I would highly recommend this if getting to that next level in world building is something you're interested in achieving. Book number 3 is going to be for anyone interested in writing any sort of dystopia or post-apocalyptic story. And that is going to be The Modern Survival Manual by Fernando Aguirre. He goes by Furfel. This is a self-published book. It was self-published in 2009. Mr. Furfel lived through the socio-economic collapse of Argentina in 2001. There was a standard of living very similar to America. This was not a third world country. This was very much a first world country. Within a matter of months, they went from life as normal to hyperinflation. So bad that it got to the point where money one day was not worth the same as it would be the next day. People would get their paycheck day to day, no longer week to week or bi-weekly. And then they would, as soon as they got their money, they would rush to the store to buy anything of physical value, because at least that would hold its value, the money wouldn't. So $20 one day would be worth 20 cents the next day. The inflation rate was insane. Inside this book, you will find a wealth of detail and example on how a dystopia or a post-apocalyptic scenario works in a modern society with modern technology. This was 2001. He talks about still meeting with business partners at a local McDonald's while there is a raid going on across the street and while protesters are marching their way. So really, if you think about it, this is a modern day first world account of a dystopia in a country very similar to the United States. If you have any interest in writing a dystopia, in writing a post-apocalyptic that is current day or near future, you need to be reading this book. This book will give you a wealth of information about details of everyday life of living in a post-apocalyptic world. He talks about how well-off women stopped wearing gold jewelry and started wearing silver jewelry because, We Buy Gold stores started popping up on every corner, and anyone wearing gold was likely to get jumped in the street, have their jewelry stolen so that they could go pawn it off on these We Buy Gold places. So silver became a very popular jewelry choice. He talked about a lot of schools breaking down simply because it wasn't safe anymore to send your kids to school. So neighborhood schools were established by some of the stay-at-home moms. But after a while, even those broke down because the stay-at-home moms had to go out and get jobs. These are the sorts of just little everyday details, and there are so many in this book that will really bring depth to your story and will make your world building seem that much more real. Book number 4 is for anyone interested in writing a retelling. This is Politically Correct Bedtime Stories by James Gardner, and this is a really quick read. It was originally published in 1994 and spent over 60 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It's really short. It's 79 pages long, and there are 13 classic fairy tales all revisited. I suggest this one because the stories are entirely retellings. They're very familiar, but they're so ridiculous. Some are funnier than others, but they're so ridiculous in the way the author retold them. It might be a very good way just to give yourself a little jump on how to take a different look at a bunch of fairy tales, a little tiny crash course in how to rethink some of the classic tales. My 5th book recommendation is for anyone looking to write an action thriller or a book with a lot of warfare or anything where someone has to kill someone else, which is a lot of books. And that is going to be On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. The author is a U.S. Army Ranger and a former professor of psychology at West Point. It was published in 2014 and is currently on the FBI's required reading list for new agents. The book focuses on the history of warfare and the history of conditioning human beings on how to kill other human beings. This is another one of those books I could go on for hours about because it is very well detailed, it is very well researched, it is very well laid out, and getting from point A to point B to point C makes sense in the book. There is a lot that is talked about in this book that would be useful to a lot of writers. The book goes into detail about how post-traumatic stress syndrome is developed. A lot of authors treat this as a one-off. Say a soldier had a very bad experience or a bomb went off and that automatically leads to PTSD. That's not true. There are a lot of factors that go into PTSD, including the support structure that's available once a soldier gets home. Writing characters with PTSD is really very popular right now. It's a common way to handle a rough backstory in a character. However, it's not always handled very well. If you're interested in writing a character with PTSD, I strongly recommend this book for research. This is also a really good choice if you are writing a fantasy or a science fiction where there is a large army by conscription. In other words, a non-volunteer army. He talks a lot about conditioning and the ways a reluctant army is kept in line, historically speaking, including the use of atrocities, the use of institutionalized rape. All of these things are discussed in this book in a way that is very relevant and makes a lot of sense and is easy to follow. He also talks about emotional distance in this book, both from the soldier's point of view and from the civilian's point of view, the civilians that are, getting bombed or invaded or whatever. And he talks about what sorts of military strategies are more likely to backfire and cause your enemy to become more determined to beat you versus actually intimidate them and work toward your cause. So for anyone wanting to write anything along those lines, I recommend this book. My sixth book and last one for today is for anyone looking to write romance, specifically trashy romance. This is an oldie but a goodie. My Secret Garden by Nancy Friday was published in 1973 during the American Sexual Revolution. This was the first book to truly analyze women's sexual fantasies in an academic sense. What Nancy Friday did is she solicited women to write to her with their sexual fantasies, what they think about, when no one's watching. She got thousands of replies. This is the largest survey of its kind, I believe, to date.
I could show you incredible things, magic, madness, heaven, sin.
So what she did, very simply, is she put all the different fantasies and letters into different categories, and she took a representative sample of each category and put them into this book. These are real women talking about what really goes on in their head.
I can make the bad guys good for a weekend.
If you are looking to break out into the romance genre, this is some invaluable information. It can tell you not only the sort of tropes that women are thinking about and therefore are more likely to search for and want to read about,
I'm dying to see how this one ends.
but it also gives you an idea of what they're looking for in that story. Now, these aren't novels, they're just what went on in their head, so there's not a clear storyline structure or anything, but it will kind of give you what these women felt were the highlights of these fantasies. And if you're writing fantasy fulfillment, this is great information to have. So that's all from me today. Talk to me in the comments and tell me what sort of books you think would be great for a writer to read, and especially ones that aren't really geared toward writers. I really like reading that sort of thing. I'd love to hear from you. So until then, bye-bye. The author is There's a golf cart outside my yard. Don't quote me on that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Fix. Did that even make grammatical sense? Just as a side note, this book was so popular, she wrote a companion book about men.